I think the essence of Dark Shadows is captured in the opening credits with the waves crashing against the rocky shore and Bob Cobert's music. It absolutely pulls you into this world of romance and eeriness. And there's something about that spookiness that just carries over into the whole show. So even if you're doing an ordinary scene, now, an ordinary, I don't know what is ordinary in Dark Shadows, but when you're doing just a lovely scene in the foyer, the fact that it's come after that music and it's pulled you into that world with the house up on the hill with just one light shining in the turret, it's magic. Dark Shadows is really about this small coastal town, Collinsport, and the Collins family, very wealthy, powerful, influential family. And it is about a young girl, Victoria Winters, who's a governess who goes back to that place. And by the way, Dark Shadows has always had the feeling of sort of a 19th century story. Even though it's told in the present, it's always got that feeling of being removed somehow from the entire rest of the country. But it's a story with ghosts, vampires, werewolves, and phoenixes, and all sorts of supernatural things. But the fundamental essence of the story is a young girl going back, who's been adopted, who's grown up in an orphanage, trying to find her roots. And I think that is also part of what pulls the audience into this story. Maggie Evans is one of the core characters of the story. I think that one of the things that, again, draws fans to the show is that it's a taste of romance and mystery. And here you have Maggie Evans, who's a waitress, a fast-talking, tough little broad working in a diner, and eventually she becomes the governess for the famous Collins family at the Collinwood Mansion, and she gets to marry the vampire. It is an extraordinary tale of a girl from very humble beginnings, whose father is an alcoholic, an itinerant painter, a girl who's lonely and sad. Everybody can identify with that. And then she has this magical existence when the vampire comes to town. I think it's amazing that Dan Curtis cast me as Maggie Evans, because at the time I was fresh off a farm in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. I had just graduated from the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and I was more of a sort of a sweet ingenue type. And then to cast me in what he saw as a young, fast-talking Eve Arden type, you know, tough little girl and working in a diner, I thought was magical. But then the fact that we got to play all of these other characters too, and that he saw me as a countess from the island of Martinique and saw me as a governess in the 1800s. He saw us in so many different kinds of roles. But I think it's amazing he cast me as Maggie Evans. I remember the very first supernatural thing that took place, and I remember Leela Swift's reaction to it. We had the old sea captain, Frank Schofield was the actor, and he showed up dripping with seaweed. He'd been drowned, and he came back, and I remember Leela Swift saying, "Dan, you know, we're getting awfully close to telling a ghost story here." And then came the day that little Sarah was bouncing the ball. And that was the day that Leela Swift went into Dan Curtis and she said, "I'm sorry, but we are now doing a ghost story. We are seeing this character interact with real people, and then we're seeing her alone in a room bouncing a ball." We've now broken into the supernatural.
And what was Dan's reaction to Leela saying, "We've crossed the line"?
Dan's reaction to almost everything was, "So?" I mean, every time that I think the ABC network told him he'd never get away with it, or Leela Swift, the director, would say, "Dan, nobody will ever accept this," Dan would say, "So what?" He always trusted the audience. Again, it is his masterful way of storytelling. He really understands what an audience can buy. He really does trust them. Dan Curtis always told us that Dark Shadows came out of a dream that he had. And if he had a dream, you know that there were always supernatural elements in that dream. And it had to do with visiting an old house and seeing a ghost and hearing a story about it. And that was something that was always there from the very beginning. I think even if it was unconsciously, Dan always knew that he would bring in supernatural elements. I think that was just part of the landscape of his mind. Dan Curtis is a bear of a man. He's just a big, rumpled kind of guy, and fierce. We were all afraid of this guy, but I have to tell you, he is a genius.